congratulations to the philosophers at the University of Costa Rica for putting together such an impressive international conference. I guess it's one of the small benefits of the current situation that we can so quickly put together an international conference of this caliber. But let's hope that it's not going to be our indefinite future to meet on Zoom like this, or exclusively on Zoom. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have a handout, which I should, I guess, put up on the screen. I apologize that it has, on some pages, way too many words on it for a proper handout. Can you see the handout on the screen?
Yes, we can.
So, as my title, as I say, is Kripke, Quine, the Adoption Problem and the Empirical Conception of Logic. And this is joint work with Crispin Wright. I begin with the observation that there is a difference between the sentence, it's sunny, and the sentence, if it's sunny, then it's sunny. The first one looks like it will require empirical justification. If it is to be justifiably believed, you've got to open your eyes and have a look. Or testimony, which would depend on that. But in the case of the second, it looks to be not only a priori, as we say, but what I call epistemically analytic, that is, justifiably believable, merely in virtue of being understood. And a similar point goes for the inferential versions of this. So, for the inference, if it's sunny, then it's warm. That would be empirical, but the inference from it's sunny, so it's sunny, would appear to be epistemically analytic, that is justifiably believable just in virtue of being understood. A helpful distinction that I will just mention here is between weak a priori justification and strong a priori justification. This is a distinction made by Hartree Field. So if a belief that P has a weak a priori justification, that means it's been justified without the benefit of sensory evidence. If it has strong a priori justification, then it means it has weak a priori justification, but furthermore cannot be refuted by purely empirical considerations. Now, in Two Dogmas, as we all know, Quine outlined a conception of the philosophy of logic, according to which no logical truth or inference can be either strongly or weakly a priori justified. And he summarizes this conception in this very memorable passage, which you will all be familiar with. Any statement can be held true come what may if we make drastic enough adjustments in the system. Even a statement very close to the periphery can be held true in the face of the experience by pleading hallucination or by amending certain statements of the kind called logical laws. Conversely, by the same token, no statement of revision. Revision, even of the logical law of the excluded middle, has been proposed as a means of simplifying quantum mechanics. And what difference is there in principle between such a shift and the shift whereby Kepler superseded Ptolemy, or Einstein Newton, or Darwin Aristotle? So this is a very famous resonant passage. And you can see that the rejection of strong a priority of logic is explicit, and the rejection even of weak a priority is implicit in the way in which it assimilates logic to empirical theory in general. And so this passage has come to be the kind of clarion call of what we might call the anti-exceptionalist conception of logic, which says that insofar as its epistemology is concerned, logic is no different to empirical theory. And through Quine's vast influence, we have become used to this type of view, and I think a little bit too inured to its shock value. But it is shocking because it's very hard to see how it could be right to claim that such propositions as, and I'm sorry, they're not on the handout, but they're nothing special. If P, then P, or if for all x, fx, then A is F, and modus ponens, if P and if P then Q, or their corresponding inference patterns, might count as refuted if rejecting them would help with simplifying quantum mechanics. I mean, that's just a remarkable connection to think that, things that are so hard to deny would count as refuted if somehow rejecting them helped with microscopic physical theorizing. Okay. Now it's true, of course, that we have found, occasionally have found, and might find some more, that some seemingly intuitive, self-evident logical principles lead to paradox, so that something needs to be revised. So intuitive evidence about basic logic is not infallible, but paradox-driven revision of logic would be revision of logic on a priori grounds, not on empirical ones. How did Quine propose to make this fairly counterintuitive view plausible? Well, as readers of Two Dogmas know, Quine's first move is to try to undermine the idea of the analytic. And in particular, one important notion of the analytic, namely the idea that you could get to be justified in believing something just by understanding it, right? Because if you could, then, well, maybe you could add some empirical justification to it, but the justification wouldn't always be completely empirical. But having done that to his satisfaction, he then considers how else logic might be justified. And of course, his answer is that it is like everything else. The justification is at bottom empirical. How do we make sense of that? Well, in just the way that Quine tries to do, by arguing that logic is just another, albeit central aspect of the web of belief, and that everything in that web earns its positive epistemic status by being part of the best, simplest, and most effective overall empirical theory of the world. Thus, just as all swans are white keeps getting better confirmed as we observe more and more white swans and no non-white swans, so too does, if all swans are white, then this swan is white. That too earns its keep by continued, as it were, empirical confirmation. And just as all swans are white might need to be relied on the observation of some non-white swan, if bleeding hallucination proves not to be a viable response, so too might, if all swans are white, then this one is white, if the overall theory runs into something recalcitrant, to which the best response would be to reconsider unrestricted universal instantiation. So in short, everything gets to have the very same justification as everything else. We can distinguish here in the Quinean conception two different theses: the empirical confirmation thesis and the empirical revision thesis. So the empirical confirmation thesis says that everything acquires confirmation by earning its keep in empirical theorizing and not coming under any kind of doubt. And the second, that anything, including the most basic logical laws, could be revised if it conferred certain kinds of benefit on empirical theorizing. Now, I think it's largely because we don't have, in fact, a very good account of how logic could be a priori, that Quine's idea has had enormous influence and perhaps even could be called hegemonic. And a notable example of Quine's conception was Putnam's proposal in the in the 70s or late 60s that the empirical successes of quantum physics gave us reason to reject the classical distributive law principles for conjunction and disjunction. Now, in 1974, Sol Kripke gave a seminar at Princeton in which he argued that Quine's anti-exceptionalist view of logic depended upon a confusion of logical belief and inferential practice. If you paid attention to this distinction, Kripke seemed to want to say, you would find that the claim that any logical law or inference pattern, no matter how basic, could in principle be rejected on purely empirical grounds and an alternative be adopted in its place is unsustainable. And we're fortunate now to have a transcript of that lecture, and this has given rise to a very considerable recent literature on this so-called adoption problem, where the adoption, it's claimed that the Quinean conception commits itself to any logical principle being in principle adoptable, and Kripke is going to show that there is in fact a problem in supposing that in full generality, any basic logical principle could be adopted, thereby refuting a central pillar of the Quinean conception of logic. Now, what I propose to do in this talk, I don't know how much of it I'll be able to get to, is I first of all want to look at the original adoption problem, the one that is presented by Kripke in his lectures and very nicely articulated by Romina Padró in her dissertation and in subsequent papers. I will then argue that the original adoption problem has a couple of vulnerabilities that give the anti-exceptionalist wiggle room to reject it. They are controversial, and one could easily see grounds for rejecting them. However, what Crispin and I try to do is use that discussion as a springboard for developing a new adoption problem, thereby vindicating Kripke's original insight into this, but we give an argument that is different from his and that has different implications for the philosophy of logic. So first, the original adoption problem, then we'll see what might be resisted about it, then we'll develop our own new adoption problem, which we call the lambda operator adoption problem, and then we will look at what the implications might be of that new adoption problem for the epistemology of logic. It's a handful, and I haven't really timed myself or anything, so we'll see how we go. Now, the first thing we need to do is look at some preliminary notions involving rule following and inference. So first thing is, we need to, that is too much. We need to, when I scroll down, is the handout scrolling down as well? Good.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. I'm not very familiar with the sharing screens. So one important distinction, of course, is between believing in the soundness of a logical principle and using that principle in your reasoning. It's the distinction that Charles Peirce referred to following the medievals as the distinction between your logica docens and your logica utens. And the main examples of the basic logical rules that are involved in this discussion have been universal instantiation and modus ponens, and we will work with the following cartoon versions of these rules. The niceties, which one should get into if one wants to formulate them correctly, won't be relevant for present purposes. So for any predicates f and g, given a premise to the effect that all f's are g, you may infer this if f is g, as the cartoon version of ui, and modus ponens for any propositions p and q, given premises to the effect that P, and if P then Q, you may infer Q. Now, we presumably understand well enough, at least as well as we understand belief, what it is to believe these principles to be sound. But what is it to have a practice of inferring with such rules? Now, a common thought is that to have a practice of following a rule, any rule, and in particular this kind of rule of inference, is not just a matter of being disposed to conform to it, but requires some kind of cognitive downwards connection from the content of the rule to the disposition to conform to it. And we can call this guidance rule following. So to have a practice of following a rule R is to be disposed to conform to R as a result of guidance by R. Now, some philosophers, including some of my colleagues, find this to be too rich a notion of rule following, at least in full generality. And they are happier with something that we might just call conformity rule following, or some people refer to as a dispositional account of rule following. So it is to have a practice of following a rule R is to be appropriately disposed to conform to R. Now you need that appropriately there because, you know, mere rule conformity is clearly not enough for rule following. The planets conform to rules, they move in elliptical orbits, but that they're not following any rule. So the pure dispositionalist needs to do something about that, and they either talk about ideal conditions or they talk about second order dispositions to correct, although why that would count as correction is left unclear, etc. But we will not here try to take a stand on this issue, but we bring it up in part because, as we will see, the kind of notion of adoption that Kripke and Padrot are interested in is committed to guidance rule following. So the way they characterize adoption involves the notion of guidance. So to see this, let's turn to asking what it is to adopt a logical principle in the relevant technical sense being targeted by Kripke and Padrot. In the relevant sense, this notion of adoption is what I will call free, explicit adoption. Now, free in the sense that the agent is not committed to the validity of the pattern of inference in question merely as a result of understanding the ingredient conceptual notions. Okay. So merely in virtue of understanding all, it doesn't follow that you see that the pattern instantiated by universal instantiation is valid. So, and explicit in the sense that you've got to be moved to the practice in question, namely inferring according to UI, in virtue of explicitly considering a formulation of UI and having that contextually guide you. So that's why I said, since this notion in this strict sense involves both of these elements, the notion of adoption is committed to guidance rule following, and it's also committed to the rule being adopted, R, let's call it, not being epistemically analytic in either of the two senses that I distinguish in my own work. That is, neither constitutively analytic, where the rule, where operating with the rule is constitutive of your understanding of the relevant concept, or where you can simply by reflection on the concept itself see that the pattern of inference in question is valid, as would be the case if you grasp the notion of is taller than, okay, and on that basis came to see that is taller than has to be transitive. Now, I will say more about this later on, but I'll just flag it here. Moreover, we just assume that any rule can be represented in this way. If conditions of type C obtain, one may, mustn't try, etc. So what's the argument for the original adoption problem? Well, a natural thought is that guidance rule following is always inferential rule following. So that the way in which a general conditional statement is going to guide your behavior is going to require you to infer from the general statement of the rule what is called for in the particular circumstances that you find yourself in and acting accordingly. So the guidance here, which is fixed, is understood inferentially. And you know, we often do follow rules inferentially, without a doubt. For instance, in chess, if you want to see whether you may castle, you consider the conditions that have to obtain for your castling to be permitted, and you check that those conditions are satisfied, and you infer that you may castle, and then you may or may not castle on that basis. So similarly, on this picture, if you have an inferential model of rule following and you apply it to this rule of inference, then you'd have to reason, well, I have the premises that all swans are white. UI tells me that given the premise of that form, I may infer any instance of the form specified. So I may indeed infer to this if a swan is white. And now, if we have that inferential model of rule guidance, we see that there really is an adoption problem for both UI and MPP, because they will both have the following form. If you have premises of such and such a character, you may infer a conclusion of thus and so a character. And an application of either rule to generate guidance about a particular case will thus require both instantiation and detachment. This is on the inferential model. So on the assumption of the inferential model, it appears that there is an adoption problem for both, at least for both MPP and UI. So before looking at whether there is a problem here for the Quinean, before looking at whether there's a problem with this argument, let's consider what its significance for the Quinean conception of logic might be if it were conceded. Now, one point to make is that it's not immediately clear how it would bear on the confirmation thesis, because you know, what we said is that the Quinean conception has both a confirmation aspect and a revision aspect. And the confirmation thesis just says that confirmation continues to accrue as this thing works its way in empirical theory and doesn't come under any suspicion. But that doesn't seem to embroil it in any thesis about the practitioners adopting UI in the specified technical sense. So it's hard to see how an adoption problem of the kind that Crick and Padreau have would bear on the confirmation thesis. On the other hand, the revision thesis does look to be more directly effective, because a proposal to rationally revise some aspect of our existing logical practice requires that you explicitly identify the culprit in question, and typically, we will look at scenarios where this happens and scenarios where it doesn't, but typically suggest an explicitly formulated alternative in its place, whose adoption is then supposed to contextually guide the change in the inferential practice. And if you could show that there is a problem with this notion of adoption, then certainly the thesis that says you can always revise and adopt an alternative can't be true in full generality, because there will be some logical principles that won't be adoptable in that sense. Now, however, fortunately for the anti-exceptionalist, I think there are at least two big vulnerabilities in the argument for the original adoption problem as I've just laid it out. The first one stems from the assumption that the argument needs to make, and it's what we call the already assumption here on page 4. The way the argument works is it says, look, a rule given as an explicit statement cannot contextually guide subsequent inferential practice unless the inferential dispositions which need to be exercised in applying it are already in place independently and in advance of receipt of the explicit statement. Okay, that's the so-called already assumption. But you could ask, in the spirit of poking holes at this argument, why do the relevant inferential practices already have to be in place? Why couldn't it be the case that receipt of an explicit statement of UI, for example, go on contextually to inform both regular first-order applications and the higher-order applications that are putatively involved in one's recognition of the license the explicit statement provides for any first-order applications. So there is a hole there. I mean, it looks as though this assumption should be true, but I couldn't find a way of arguing for it. And so it is a vulnerability that somebody may exploit in seeking to reject the original adoption problem. The second vulnerability is, I think, even more severe, and that is the reliance that the argument has to make on the inferential model of guidance. That is, it has to assume that whenever a general conditional rule guides your behavior contextually, that is via its content, it has to do so inferentially by your inferring something from the content of the rule and doing what it calls for under the circumstances. But it's quite clear for two big reasons that that the inferential model of contextual guidance is not mandatory. The first has to do with a very general argument, which is something I described in a paper in 2008 called Epistemic Rules, which is to point out that if you combine an inferential model of rule following along with a rule following model of inference, you will get this kind of instability. One of them will have to go because it will generate a super task to follow any rule. So the idea is, if you think of following a rule as involving an inference from the formulation of the rule, and you think of inference, as we have been doing, as involving general rules that you follow, you will get a problem no matter what else you're doing, and in particular, whether or not you're interested in the notion of adoption. So since we are already highly implicated in a rule following model of inference, where when you do a modus ponens inference, that is the exercise of a general capacity to follow rules of that form. There you already have reason to give up on the fully general claim that rule following always involves inference. So that's number one. Number two is we could think of examples, quotidian examples, in which we seem to follow rules, but without always having to infer. So for example, you might be tennis player who forms the policy that they will answer something that comes to the left in this way and something that comes to the right in this way, and you will then act on that general policy without constantly having to infer what it calls for, but rather automatically. Or you consider an email rule, which I've discussed, which in order to prevent things from drifting down in the inbox and never being seen again, you answer any email that calls for an answer immediately upon receipt. And it seems as though one can act on that rule without always having to infer what it calls for in the circumstances. Now, I used to think that making theoretical sense out of the notion of non-inferential guidance by a general conditional rule non-inferentially was quite hard, but I've come to think actually that it's not that hard and can be clarified quite effectively. I won't, I guess, do that here because I'm mindful of the time, but we can talk about that in the Q&A if people wish. So, I mean, if these points are true, then the anti-exceptionalist has some very significant wiggle room getting out of Kripke's original adoption problem, because they can question both the already assumption and the inferential model of guidance, and it won't be ad hoc that they do so. However, what Crispin and I think, having thought about Kripke's argument, is that although it's vulnerable in this way, there is in fact a significant difficulty of exactly the kind that he was after, with the free adoptability of basic logical principles, but not for exactly the reasons that Kripke gave. And so what I'll try to do next is develop our version of a free adoption problem for basic logical principles. So consider Padrot's example of the fictional Harry. Harry does not yet have the practice of universal instantiation. He's not disposed to infer this F is G from an acceptance of the statement all F's are G. He is supposed to have some kind of understanding of the universal quantifier, but not, as I say, one that commits him to the rationality of being a UI inferrer, because if it did, then it wouldn't be a candidate for free adoption. So it has, that bit has to be part of the stipulation. The question is whether he can rationally come to appropriately extend his practice of becoming a UI inferrer by receiving a suitable statement of the rule of UI, along with some empirical Quinean reasons for believing the rule to be sound. So the question is, can someone whose understanding of this quantifier so far gives him nothing in virtue of which he might recognize a commitment to the practice of UI, freely adopt UI, that is, explicitly take it on board as a new rule, and thereby institute a practice of inference in accordance with that pattern? Well, you have to ask yourself, suppose you do give Harry a statement of UI. How is he to understand any particular general statement of UI that he may be given? Such a statement will itself embed something equivalent to universal quantification. So if Harry parses it, if he receives it, as it were, in terms of the instantiation neutral understanding of the quantifier that he had before he got the statement, then what he thereby understands is nothing that he can use to derive and practice the new pattern of inference that the statement is intended to mandate for him. So if an understanding of the explicit statement of UI were to somehow prompt him into the appropriate extension of the inferential practice, this prompting cannot be viewed as contentual guidance. as teaching given to him just by the statement of UI itself, but must somehow worked in some other ways to trigger a shift in his understanding of quotes all. So this is the germ of the new adoption problem that we believe we have unearthed, even after we discard the inferential model of rule guidance. Remember that argument for that turned on the inferential dispositions already being in place and the inferential model of rule guidance. This new point, though, is not about any of those things. It is that however contextual guidance is supposed to work, the understanding that Harry has of the principal logical operator in a statement of a given inferential rule can only guide him towards a practice in conformity with it, whatever it was, i.e. with his prior understanding. Accordingly, he cannot be contextually guided towards any change in his practice by the explicit statement. So that's the nub of it, and now the generalization. Basically, you see what the generalization is supposed to be. Any rule whose characteristic inferential profile involves the use of an operator that the rule effectively implicates is going to be subject to this difficulty. Let me say that again. In order to be available for free adoption, R, the rule, must be a new rule, independent of one's antecedent grasp of its principal operator lambda. But if all one gets by way of explanation of the new inferential practices it ordains is just a statement of R, one has no basis but to interpret that statement in terms of the very notion of lambda that it is supposed to supersede, and so will be offered no path to the novel practices the rule is supposed to encode. Thus, there is indeed an adoption problem for a wide class of logical notions and associated rules, and in contrast with the OAP, it arises independently of the already assumption and the inferential model of rule guidance. Now, how wide a class of operators? Well, obviously we're talking about a logical notion. We'll say that the logical notion is basic, just if a canonical statement of its characteristic inferential profile must essentially involve meta-theoretic use of a counterpart of lambda itself. We'll call these lambda operators, and the preceding points that I made about the adoption problem applies to any lambda operator and its characteristic inferential profile. Of course, within a given language or idiolect, some connectives will be semantical primitives and others will be definable in terms of them. That's where our notion of a lambda operator is clearly relative to what the choice of the semantical primitives is in any given case and what's definable in terms of them. But that's a choice that will have to be made for any given language or idiolect. And so once that's fixed, the notion of a lambda operator is defined accordingly. Now, suppose this is right, what are the consequences for the Quinean conception of logic, of this new adoption? We call it the LOAP, the lambda operator adoption problem, not to be confused with the notion of a lambda function already in existence. So let's look first at the confirmation thesis. Remember, the Quinean conception is the confirmation thesis and the revision thesis. Let's say that a justification for an accepted hypothesis H of an empirical theory is Quinean, just in case it consists in the discovery that the theory performs well by whatever criteria are deemed appropriate before the tribunal of experience and would work less well if deprived of H. Quine's idea, and that of contemporary anti-exceptionalists, is that the logic, including the basic logical principles, which an empirical theory incorporates, insofar as it admits of any justification at all, admits at most of Quinean justification in this sense. So one moral, it seems, of our LOAP is that this claim is unsustainable. You see, let's go back to Harry, and let's just work with the example of UI. And recall, Harry has some kind of understanding of all, but so far no practice of universal instantiation. There are two cases to consider. First, suppose that UI is not a candidate for free adoption for Harry, but rather that the inferential practice in accord with UI is indeed somehow built in to his understanding of all, either in the sense of an inferential role semantics, or in the sense in which the admissibility of inference via transitivity is built into an understanding of his taller than. Maybe it's like that, but it simply hasn't occurred to him that this is so. Then intuitively, Harry already has a justification for adopting UI, the same species of justification that someone has on whom it dawns for the first time that is downstream of is a transitive relation and accordingly adopts a principle to that effect. So the anti-exceptionalists claim that the only justification one can have for a basic logical principle is Quinean cannot be sustained in this first case. Well, then look at the second case. Suppose instead that UI is a candidate for free adoption by Harry. Nothing in his prior understanding of all commits him to accepting it. Can he acquire a Quinean reason to do so? It seems not. It's no good just spontaneously accepting what we would regard as an adequate formulation of UI and seeing what payoffs accrue from working with it. There won't be any payoffs since he won't be disposed to apply the principle in the way that will be needed in order to generate them, but will understand them in the old instantiation neutral way as before. And for the same reason, it's no good giving him a statement like I've got on the handout benefit plus if you fall in with this extension of your previous pattern of use of all, you may expect the following benefits. Since all being a lambda operator, the characterization we offer of the extended practice will already have to incorporate an understanding of this extended practice if it's to help him at all. So far, one application of the LOAP to Quine's confirmation thesis. Now, you might think, look, even if I concede that something along these lines is going to work against the confirmation thesis, how damaging is that really to the Quinean view? It might be thought not very for two distinct or related reasons. One of them is that you might think that all that this kind of epistemic analyticity, that is understanding-driven justification, can give you is not a real justification for believing a logical principle, but something more like a rationale. Okay. Because maybe a similar rationale could be given for somebody using the concept tonk, because presumably you don't want to say that the person is really justified in inferring anything from anything. But you can see how, as it were, if you're employing tonk and you know its constitutive rules, you would have a rationale for doing that. And second objection is that even if we allow that the lambda operator in question is, unlike tonk, a legitimate concept, it might seem that there's still a question whether the concept in question is optimal or even a good one for a thinker to use in empirical theory. So these are two ways of saying, look, even if we concede that something along the lines of what you described is correct, the impact is minimal because, first of all, the operator in question might be like tonk, and secondly, it's consistent with saying that this concept is legitimate and this is its constitutive inferential profile, and so you're justified in employing it. However, who says that that makes it a good or even an optimal concept to be using in empirical theory? Now, I think the first question isn't really worth taking that seriously, because it's arguable that Tonk expresses no real concept since its constitutive rules aren't coherently followable. By contrast, if and all not only seem to be perfectly fine, they or something very like them are arguably indispensable for any thought more sophisticated than the most elementary. And in any case, it does seem to border on the incoherent to suppose that, strictly speaking, we can't know that if P then P on the basis of understanding if, but can only know that if P then P only if expresses a legitimate concept in good standing. There's the way of entering the qualification seems to rely on the very concept it's disputing. The second challenge, though, might seem more credible. Perhaps it's not out of the question to doubt whether if or all are legitimate concepts. Still, isn't it consistent to wonder whether they are the optimal concepts with which to think? And here, this would be analogous to the way in which you might be able to raise a question about geometry. Yes, of course, we understand and consider as perfectly legitimate Euclidean and non-Euclidean concepts of point and line and so on. And relative to each of those sets of concepts, their appropriate principles are correct. Still, we can raise a question which geometry is, as it were, correct about the actual world. And so maybe something similar could be asked about logic, even if we concede that certain principles are epistemically or analytically linked to their ingredient operators. But I think the analogy between logic and geometry is hard to sustain. In the case of geometry, we can make sense of the difference between pure and applied geometry, distinguishing between geometric primitives that define abstract geometric structures and those that correctly characterize the structure of physical space. What, though, would constitute an analogous distinction in the case of logic? What's the difference between pure and applied logic? If you're thinking with classical constants, double negation elimination is valid both for thought and for the real world. And if you're thinking with intuitionistic constants, it's just as invalid for both. In any case, what does works optimally well in scientific theorizing have to do with being a valid logical principle? The validity of a logical principle licenses its use in arbitrary reasoning about counterfactual circumstances, including circumstances in which physical law is hypothesized to fail. How exactly does the entrenchment of principles of inference in empirical theory that has proven to work well for our actual circumstances rationally mandate confidence in their use in reasoning about circumstances of quite another kind? So, so much for the impact of LOAP on the confirmation thesis. Let me turn now to the revision thesis. In discussing revision, as I say, I think we should distinguish between two scenarios. One in which we have a proposal to reject on empirical grounds an accepted inferential law or practice without replacement, and another in which the empirically motivated rejection of an accepted law or practice is combined with a proposal that we adopt an alternative law or practice in its place. You know, as far as I can remember, and I wrote a paper about this as an undergraduate, Putnam's original 1969 proposal was simply that we give up the distributive principles without proposing anything in their place. So we should distinguish between, as it were, a revision that is a mere rejection of some thesis, and another scenario in which there's a rejection plus adoption of an alternative principle. Now, interestingly, I think neither mere rejection nor rejection plus adoption can be true in full generality if our LOAP is correct. So let's begin with mere rejection. It looks prima facie hard to see how an adoption problem can automatically make trouble for a proposed revision of logic that consists merely in a proposal to reject some basic rule, as I said previously. However, I think it's not right to say that mere rejection is off the hook. And to appreciate why, suppose this time that Harry, now an adult, accepts both modus ponens and UI and practices them perfectly normally in the context of an empirical theory, which is repeatedly hitting snags. Might he rationally treat these snags as an empirical reason for ceasing to practice UI and MPP? If so, the reason must presumably consist in something like acquiring forceful evidence for a proposition like benefit minus on the handout. If I fall in with the total rejection of UI or MPP practice, I can expect to avoid the problems and singularities I've been having. Well, I think it's obvious that the implementation of benefit minus in Harry's future practice, his acting on the recommendation it offers, will require him to instantiate it to particular cases and to detach across its contained conditional. So if total rejection of UI MPP is what's recommended by benefit minus, Harry won't be able coherently to rationalize action on this new policy. Of course, if the recommendation of a benefit minus type proposition were merely that we should partially restrict UI MPP practice, the instantiation / detachments might be, which implementing benefit minus would involve, might be among the permitted exceptions. I don't know, we'd need to see a worked out example. But however that may turn out, this argument is still enough to show that Quinean mere rejection cannot be true in full generality. The proposal that we might have rational reason to reject UI or MPP in toto is off the table. As for a rejection plus adoption type proposal in which the proposed adopted principles are either UI or MPP, we have already seen why no such proposal can fly. If nothing in Harry's prior understanding of all commits him to accepting UI, he cannot acquire a Quinean reason to do so. To acquire such a reason, he would have had to have accumulated powerful evidence for a proposition like benefit plus. If you fall in with this extension, and here we offer characterization of proper UI practice of your previous pattern of use, you may expect the following benefits, but as we already know, that is not going to be feasible in Harry's case because of the lambda operator nature of the quantifier involved. So there's more to the paper, but that's a good place in which to quit. We've seen that the original adoption problem has some vulnerabilities, but this new adoption problem seems to stand without those controversial assumptions and does have a very significant impact on the constitutive theses of the Quinean conception of logic. Thank you very much.